Question 1. When an internal auditor is assessing an organization's commitment to social responsibility in alignment with ISO 26000-2010, and the organization also holds ISO 9001 certification, what is the primary distinction the auditor must maintain regarding the scope of their review? Option A. Confirming that customer feedback mechanisms required by ISO 9001 are also used to gauge stakeholder perceptions of social responsibility performance. Option B. Verifying that all ISO 26000 core subjects are integrated into the existing ISO 9001 documented information and process controls. Option C. Differentiating between the quality management systems focus on customer satisfaction and product conformity versus ISO 26000 broader guidance on an organization's impact on society and stakeholders. Option D. Ensuring that ISO 9001 compliance is a prerequisite for any social responsibility initiatives, as quality underpins all organizational functions. The correct answer is C. Differentiating between the quality management systems focus on customer satisfaction and product conformity versus ISO 26000 broader guidance on an organization's impact on society and stakeholders. Explanation. ISO 26000 provides guidance on social responsibility, outlining core subjects and principles. ISO 9001, on the other hand, specifies requirements for a quality management system. While ISO 9001 is a certifiable standard focused on customer satisfaction and consistent product/service quality, ISO 26000 is a guidance document that helps organizations understand and address their social responsibility impacts. An internal auditor examining an organization's alignment with ISO 26000 principles, particularly concerning stakeholder engagement and ethical behavior in business, would need to differentiate its scope from ISO 9001. ISO 9001 focus on process efficiency and customer requirements, while potentially overlapping with social responsibility in areas like product safety, does not inherently encompass the broader societal impacts addressed by ISO 26000, such as labor practices, human rights, environmental stewardship, and community involvement. Therefore, when assessing an organization's commitment to social responsibility beyond quality management, the auditor must look for evidence of integrating these broader societal considerations into decision-making and operations, rather than solely focusing on the documented quality management system processes required by ISO 9001. The auditor's role is to identify how the organization addresses its impacts on various stakeholders and society at large, a scope that extends significantly beyond the typical framework of a quality management system. The core difference lies in the intent and breadth of coverage. One is about product/service quality and customer satisfaction, while the other is about an organization's overall impact on society. Question 2. An internal auditor is reviewing the governance framework of a multinational manufacturing firm, focusing on its social responsibility integration. The firm has a stated commitment to environmental stewardship and community development. The auditor needs to assess the effectiveness of the firm's stakeholder engagement processes in shaping its governance decisions related to these commitments. Which of the following approaches would best demonstrate the auditor's evaluation of how stakeholder input is systematically incorporated into the organization's governance mechanisms concerning social responsibility? Option A. Analyzing the company's stock performance and market reputation following the announcement of new community development projects. Option B. Reviewing minutes of board meetings and internal policy documents to identify instances where stakeholder feedback on environmental impact and community investment was explicitly discussed and influenced policy changes or strategic decisions. Option C. Interviewing the Public Relations Department to understand their general approach to managing stakeholder communications and addressing public concerns. Option D. Examining the company's annual sustainability report for a section dedicated to stakeholder engagement, noting the number of stakeholder groups consulted. The correct answer is B. Reviewing minutes of board meetings and internal policy documents to identify instances where stakeholder feedback on environmental impact and community investment was explicitly discussed and influenced policy changes or strategic decisions. Explanation. ISO 26000-2010 provides guidance on how an organization can operate in a socially responsible manner. Evaluating stakeholder engagement in governance involves assessing the effectiveness and inclusivity of the processes through which an organization interacts with its stakeholders regarding its social responsibility performance and decision-making. This assessment should consider how well the organization has identified its relevant stakeholders, understood their expectations and concerns, and integrated this understanding into its governance structures and processes. The internal auditor's role is to verify that these engagements are systematic, transparent, and responsive, contributing to the organization's overall social responsibility objectives. A key aspect is examining whether feedback mechanisms are in place and actively used to inform strategic direction and operational adjustments, ensuring that governance truly reflects a commitment to social responsibility. This includes reviewing documentation of engagement activities, records of stakeholder input, and evidence of how this input has influenced organizational decisions and policies. The auditor must also ensure that the engagement processes are fair and accessible to all relevant stakeholder groups, preventing any form of exclusion or bias. This thorough evaluation helps determine the maturity and effectiveness of the organization's social responsibility governance framework. Question 3. An internal auditor is preparing to assess an organization's adherence to principles outlined in ISO 26000, focusing on its engagement with local communities and its environmental impact. Considering the inherent complexities of social responsibility assurance, what is the most critical factor to evaluate during the internal risk assessment of the audit process itself to ensure its effectiveness and credibility? Option A. The auditor's proficiency in interpreting relevant local environmental regulations and understanding the socio-economic context of the community engagement activities. Option B. The availability of marketing materials detailing the organization's social responsibility achievements. Option C. The number of employees within the organization who are directly involved in social responsibility initiatives. Option D. The historical financial performance of the organization over the past 5 fiscal years. The correct answer is A. The auditor's proficiency in interpreting relevant local environmental regulations and understanding the socio-economic context of the community engagement activities. Explanation. When conducting an internal audit of an organization's social responsibility performance, a crucial step is assessing the risks associated with the audit process itself. This risk assessment informs the audit plan, resource allocation, and methodology. The objective is to identify potential threats that could compromise the audit's effectiveness, accuracy, or impartiality. Such risks might include the auditor's lack of expertise in a specific social responsibility area, the availability of reliable data, potential conflicts of interest, the organization's resistance to scrutiny, or the complexity of the social responsibility issues being audited. For instance, auditing an organization's commitment to fair labor practices in a global supply chain involves risks related to accessing verifiable information from overseas suppliers, understanding diverse cultural norms and labor laws, and potential retaliation against whistleblowers. A thorough risk assessment helps the auditor prioritize audit areas, select appropriate audit techniques, e.g., interviews, document review, site visits, data analytics, and develop contingency plans. It's not about calculating a numerical risk score, but rather a qualitative or semi-quantitative evaluation of the likelihood and impact of identified threats to the audit's overall success in providing assurance on the organization's social responsibility commitments and practices, as guided by ISO 26000. The ultimate goal is to ensure the audit provides credible and useful information for improvement. Question 4. An internal auditor is evaluating an organization's adherence to the principles of social responsibility concerning education and culture, as outlined in ISO 26000-2010. The organization operates in a region with a rich but fragile indigenous cultural heritage. Which of the following activities would represent the most robust demonstration of the organization's commitment to this aspect of social responsibility? Option A. Implementing a mandatory diversity training program for all employees that briefly covers the history and customs of the local indigenous population as part of a broader curriculum on global cultures. Option B. Sponsoring an annual local arts festival that showcases diverse cultural expressions from the broader region, with a specific but limited mention of indigenous heritage in promotional materials. Option C. Providing financial donations to a national museum that houses artifacts from various cultures, including some from the local indigenous community, without direct engagement in local cultural activities. Option D. establishing a formal partnership with local cultural preservation societies to co-fund and actively participate in initiatives aimed at documenting and revitalizing endangered indigenous languages and traditional crafts. Correct answer is D. Establishing a formal partnership with local cultural preservation societies to co-fund and actively participate in initiatives aimed at documenting and revitalizing endangered indigenous languages and traditional crafts. Explanation: ISO 26000-2010, in its guidance on social responsibility, emphasizes the importance of respecting and contributing to the cultural heritage and diversity of communities. An internal auditor assessing an organization's commitment to this aspect would look for evidence of practices that go beyond mere legal compliance. This involves understanding how the organization engages with local cultures, supports cultural institutions, and promotes cultural understanding among its stakeholders. Specifically, the auditor would examine policies and practices related to community engagement, employee training on cultural sensitivity, and the organization's contribution to preserving or promoting local arts, traditions, or historical sites. The auditor needs to differentiate between superficial gestures and genuine efforts to integrate cultural considerations into the organization's operations and its social impact. The question tests the auditor's ability to identify the most comprehensive indicator of an organization's commitment to cultural responsibility, which is demonstrated through active and supportive engagement rather than passive acknowledgement or minimal compliance. The core principle is that social responsibility in culture involves a proactive contribution to the cultural well-being of society. Question 5. An internal auditor is reviewing the integration of social responsibility into the strategic decision-making processes of a multinational manufacturing firm. The firm is considering a proposal to invest in a new production line that will significantly increase output, but also requires a substantial increase in water usage, potentially impacting local water resources and the community's access. Which of the following would provide the strongest evidence that the firm is effectively embedding social responsibility into this decision-making process, as per ISO 26000-2010 guidance? Option A. The company has published a sustainability report detailing its commitment to environmental protection and community engagement. Option B. The project manager has consulted with a local environmental non-governmental organization for feedback on the proposal. Option C. The board of directors has received a presentation on the environmental implications of the new production line, including a summary of potential risks. Option D. The decision-making framework explicitly requires a documented assessment of potential impacts on water availability and community needs, with mitigation strategies developed and integrated into the final investment proposal, alongside financial projections. The correct answer is D. The decision-making framework explicitly requires a documented assessment of potential impacts on water availability and community needs, with mitigation strategies developed and integrated into the final investment proposal, alongside financial projections. Explanation: ISO 26000-2010 emphasizes integrating social responsibility into an organization's decision-making processes. This involves considering the impacts of decisions on stakeholders and society, aligning with the core principles of accountability, transparency, ethical behavior, respect for stakeholder interests, respect for the rule of law, respect for international norms of behavior, and respect for human rights. An internal auditor assessing this integration would look for evidence that these considerations are systematically embedded. This means not just having policies, but demonstrating their application in practice. For instance, when a company decides to relocate a facility, an auditor would seek to understand if the potential impacts on the local community, employee welfare, and environmental sustainability were thoroughly evaluated and factored into the final decision, beyond purely economic considerations. This aligns with the guidance's intent to ensure that social and environmental factors are not an afterthought, but are integral to strategic and operational choices. The auditor's role is to verify that the organization has a framework for this integration, and that it is being effectively implemented, leading to decisions that are both economically viable and socially responsible. This requires looking at the criteria used for evaluating alternatives and the justification for the chosen path. Question 6. When evaluating an organization's commitment to social responsibility through the lens of ISO 26000-2010, What is the fundamental purpose of engaging in structured social dialogue with its various stakeholder groups, beyond mere information dissemination? Option A. To collaboratively identify and address social and ethical issues, fostering mutual understanding and building trust for improved social responsibility performance. Option B. To fulfill a regulatory requirement mandated by international labor conventions, ensuring compliance with minimum worker protection standards. Option C. To gather data for marketing and public relations purposes, highlighting the organization's positive contributions to society. Option D. To preemptively manage potential public relations crises by controlling the narrative around the organization's social impact. The correct answer is A. To collaboratively identify and address social and ethical issues, fostering mutual understanding and building trust for improved social responsibility performance. Explanation: ISO 26000-2010 emphasizes the importance of social dialogue as a means for an organization to engage with its stakeholders. Social dialogue, as described in the standard, involves open and inclusive communication and consultation between an organization and its stakeholders on issues of common interest related to social responsibility. This dialogue is crucial for understanding stakeholder expectations, identifying potential risks and opportunities, and building trust. An internal auditor assessing an organization's social responsibility performance would look for evidence of structured processes for social dialogue. This includes identifying the stakeholders with whom the organization engages, the mechanisms used for dialogue, e.g., surveys, meetings, forums, the frequency of engagement, and how the outcomes of these dialogues are considered in decision-making and action planning. The auditor would also assess whether the dialogue is genuinely inclusive, allowing all relevant stakeholders to express their views and concerns without undue influence. Furthermore, the auditor would examine the organization's transparency in communicating the results of social dialogue and its commitment to acting upon the feedback received. The effectiveness of social dialogue is not merely about holding meetings, but about fostering a meaningful exchange that leads to improved social responsibility practices and outcomes. This aligns with the principle of accountability and transparency inherent in social responsibility. Question 7. When an internal auditor is evaluating an organization's commitment to social responsibility concerning working conditions and social protection, which of the following actions best demonstrates an assessment that goes beyond mere legal compliance and aligns with the principles of ISO 26000-2010? Option A. Verifying that the organization provides benefits and working conditions that exceed statutory minimums, demonstrating a proactive approach to employee well-being and security, and comparing these against relevant ILO conventions. Option B. Reviewing the company's internal policies to ensure they reflect the current labor laws and that all required employee documentation is accurately maintained. Option C. Confirming that all employment contracts explicitly state adherence to the minimum wage laws and standard working hours as defined by national legislation. Option D. Auditing the payroll records to confirm that all employees are paid at least the legally mandated minimum wage and that overtime is compensated according to statutory regulations. The correct answer is A. Verifying that the organization provides benefits and working conditions that exceed statutory minimums, demonstrating a proactive approach to employee well-being and security, and comparing these against relevant ILO conventions. Explanation: an internal auditor assessing an organization's social responsibility, specifically regarding working conditions and social protection, must go beyond mere compliance with local labor laws. ISO 26000-2010 emphasizes a broader, proactive approach. While adherence to statutory minimums is a baseline, a robust social responsibility framework requires evaluating whether the organization's practices provide a level of worker well-being and security that genuinely reflects ethical considerations and stakeholder expectations, even if not explicitly mandated by law. This involves examining aspects like fair wages that support a decent standard of living, reasonable working hours that prevent undue fatigue and promote work-life balance, safe and healthy working environments that exceed basic legal requirements through proactive risk management, and comprehensive social protection measures that might include benefits beyond statutory provisions, such as enhanced health insurance, retirement plans, or support for family care. The auditor's role is to discern if the organization's efforts are merely reactive to legal obligations or if they proactively embrace the spirit of social responsibility by fostering a supportive and secure environment for its workforce. This involves looking for evidence of continuous improvement, stakeholder engagement on these issues, and alignment with international best practices, such as those outlined by the International Labor Organization (ILO) conventions, which often represent a higher standard than local legislation. The auditor must therefore assess the effectiveness and comprehensiveness of these measures in contributing to the overall social well-being of employees, rather than just checking for legal conformity. Question 8. When an internal auditor is tasked with evaluating the effectiveness of an organization's human rights risk assessment process, as per the guidance in ISO 26000-2010, which of the following actions would best demonstrate a comprehensive review of the assessment scope and depth? Option A. Checking for the existence of a documented policy on human rights that is publicly available on the company's website. Option B. Confirming that the organization has conducted at least one internal training session on human rights for its employees within the last fiscal year. Option C. Verifying that the risk assessment explicitly considers potential human rights impacts arising from the organization's entire value chain, including upstream suppliers and downstream product use, and references relevant international human rights instruments and national legislation. Option D. Reviewing the minutes of board meetings to ascertain if human rights were discussed as a strategic agenda item at least twice annually. The correct answer is C. Verifying that the risk assessment explicitly considers potential human rights impacts arising from the organization's entire value chain, including upstream suppliers and downstream product use, and references relevant international human rights instruments and national legislation. Explanation. An internal auditor reviewing a company's social responsibility framework, specifically focusing on human rights risk assessments as guided by ISO 26000-2010, needs to evaluate the thoroughness and effectiveness of the identified risks. ISO 26000 emphasizes understanding the organization's impact on human rights across its entire sphere of influence. This involves not only direct operations, but also the supply chain and relationships with stakeholders. When assessing human rights risks, an auditor must consider the potential for adverse impacts such as forced labor, discrimination, inadequate working conditions, and violations of privacy. The process of risk assessment should be comprehensive, identifying potential human rights issues, analyzing their likelihood and severity, and determining appropriate mitigation strategies. A robust assessment would integrate insights from various sources, including legal requirements, e.g., national labor laws, international conventions like the ILO core conventions, stakeholder feedback, industry best practices, and the organization's own policies. The auditor's role is to verify that the assessment process is systematic, that identified risks are relevant to the organization's context and operations, and that the mitigation plans are proportionate and effectively implemented. For instance, if a company sources raw materials from a region with known labor abuses, the risk assessment must explicitly address the potential for complicity in such abuses. Even if the company itself does not directly employ workers in that region, the auditor would then check if the company has implemented due diligence measures in its supply chain to prevent or address these risks. The effectiveness of the risk assessment is judged by its ability to anticipate and address potential negative human rights impacts before they occur, or to manage them when they arise. It's about ensuring that the organization is proactively identifying and managing its human rights responsibilities, rather than merely reacting to incidents. Question 9. An internal auditor is tasked with evaluating the effectiveness of an organization's documented procedures for engaging with local community groups regarding the environmental impact of a new manufacturing facility. The auditor reviews meeting minutes, public consultation feedback forms, and internal impact assessment reports. Which of the following types of documentary evidence would most strongly indicate that the organization has genuinely considered and addressed community concerns in its operational planning, as per the principles of ISO 26000-2010? Option A. A comprehensive list of all community groups contacted, without any indication of their specific feedback or the organization's response. Option B. Records demonstrating specific modifications to the facility's waste management system directly resulting from feedback received during community consultations. Option C. Internal memos discussing potential public relations challenges related to community concerns, but without evidence of action taken. Option D. Copies of Environmental Impact Assessment reports that mention community feedback as a general consideration, but do not detail specific responses or changes. Correct answer is B. Records demonstrating specific modifications to the facility's waste management system directly resulting from feedback received during community consultations. Explanation: ISO 26000-2010 provides guidance on social responsibility, emphasizing the importance of stakeholder engagement and transparency. When an internal auditor reviews documents and records related to an organization's social responsibility initiatives, the focus is on verifying the effectiveness and authenticity of these commitments. The auditor must assess whether the documented processes and records align with the organization's stated social responsibility policies and objectives, and whether they demonstrate genuine progress and accountability. This involves examining evidence that supports claims made about environmental performance, labor practices, community involvement, and ethical conduct. For instance, reviewing records of employee training on ethical conduct, documentation of waste reduction efforts, or minutes from stakeholder consultations are crucial. The auditor needs to determine if these records are complete, accurate, and readily available, and if they reflect actual implementation rather than just intentions. The auditor's role is not to judge the inherent merit of the social responsibility goals themselves, but to assess the robustness of the management systems and the evidence supporting their execution. This process helps ensure that the organization's social responsibility efforts are credible and contribute to its overall performance and reputation. A key aspect is to look for evidence of the integration of social responsibility principles into decision-making and operations, as reflected in the reviewed documentation. Question 10. An internal auditor is reviewing an organization's social responsibility framework. The organization has robust policies for environmental protection and fair labor practices, and these are well documented and implemented. However, during the audit, it becomes apparent that the organization's approach to consumer issues, specifically regarding product transparency and fair marketing, is less developed, with minimal documented procedures and limited evidence of consistent application. Considering the interconnectedness of ISO 26000-2010's core subjects, which of the following represents the most significant implication for the auditor's assessment of the organization's overall social responsibility performance? Option A. The auditor should focus solely on the well-performing areas, as ISO 26000-2010 is a guidance standard and does not mandate equal performance across all core subjects. Option B. The lack of development in consumer issues is a minor oversight, as the organization demonstrates strong performance in environmental and labor practices, which are generally considered more critical. Option C. The identified weakness in consumer issues significantly undermines the credibility of the organization's commitment to social responsibility, as it suggests an incomplete integration of all core subjects. Option D. The auditor must report the deficiency in consumer issues as a nonconformity, implying a breach of a mandatory requirement within the ISO 26000-2010 guidance. Correct answer is C. The identified weakness in consumer issues significantly undermines the credibility of the organization's commitment to social responsibility, as it suggests an incomplete integration of all core subjects. Explanation: ISO 26000-2010 identifies 7 core subjects of social responsibility, which are fundamental areas for an organization to address in its pursuit of social responsibility. These subjects are organizational governance, human rights, labor practices, the environment, fair operating practices, consumer issues, and community involvement and development. When an internal auditor is assessing an organization's commitment to social responsibility, they need to understand how these core subjects interrelate and how an organization's policies and practices within one subject might impact another. For instance, a company's labor practices regarding fair wages and working conditions directly relate to human rights. Similarly, environmental policies can influence community well-being and fair operating practices by ensuring responsible resource management and pollution control. The auditor's role is to verify that the organization has considered all 7 core subjects and integrated them into its operations and decision-making processes, demonstrating a holistic approach to social responsibility. An effective audit would examine the documented policies, procedures, and evidence of implementation across each of these areas, looking for consistency and a genuine commitment beyond mere compliance. The auditor must also consider relevant national legislation and international agreements that may inform the organization's responsibilities within each core subject, such as labor laws affecting labor practices or environmental regulations impacting the environment. Question 11. Following an internal audit that identified a lapse in ensuring equitable compensation practices, leading to a potential violation of principles aligned with ISO 26000-2010's guidance on labor practices and decent work, the organization implemented corrective actions. These actions included revising the internal compensation policy, conducting mandatory training for HR personnel on fair wage determination, and establishing a new grievance mechanism for employees regarding pay. As an internal auditor tasked with monitoring the effectiveness of these corrective actions, which of the following approaches would most rigorously verify that the root cause has been addressed and recurrence is prevented? Option A. Interviewing the HR manager to confirm that the revised compensation policy has been disseminated to all relevant staff, and reviewing the minutes of the last management meeting where the issue was discussed. Option B. Reviewing updated policy documents and training attendance records, followed by a targeted review of employee compensation data from the period after the corrective actions were implemented to assess for any residual pay disparities, and examining the log of the new grievance mechanism for any related complaints. Option C. Requesting a formal declaration from the head of human resources stating that the compensation practices are now fully compliant with all applicable national labor laws and the organization's updated internal policies. Option D. Examining the original audit report and comparing it with the implemented corrective actions to ensure all identified issues were technically addressed by the documented changes. The correct answer is B. Reviewing updated policy documents and training attendance records, followed by a targeted review of employee compensation data from the period after the corrective actions were implemented to assess for any residual pay disparities, and examining the log of the new grievance mechanism for any related complaints. Explanation. When an internal auditor monitors the implementation of corrective actions arising from a social responsibility audit against ISO 26000-2010, the focus is on verifying the effectiveness of the actions taken to address identified nonconformities. This involves evaluating whether the root causes of the nonconformities have been adequately treated, and if the implemented actions have led to the desired improvements in the organization's social responsibility performance. The auditor must assess if the corrective actions have been completed within the agreed timeframe, and if they have successfully prevented recurrence. This evaluation often requires gathering evidence such as updated policies, revised procedures, training records, and performance data that demonstrate a tangible positive change. It's crucial to distinguish between merely implementing a procedure and achieving the intended outcome of that procedure. For instance, if a nonconformity related to fair labor practices was identified, the corrective action might involve revising the code of conduct and conducting training. The auditor's role in monitoring is to confirm that the revised code is communicated, the training was effective, e.g., through competency assessments, and that there's a demonstrable reduction in the type of incidents that led to the original nonconformity. This process aligns with the principles of continuous improvement inherent in management system guidance. The auditor's objective is to provide assurance that the organization is genuinely addressing its social responsibility issues and not just performing superficial fixes. Therefore, the most effective monitoring approach involves a thorough review of evidence to confirm that the corrective actions have resolved the root cause and are preventing recurrence, thereby enhancing the organization's overall social responsibility. Question 12. An internal auditor is reviewing an organization's adherence to ISO 26000 principles concerning sustainable resource use. The organization, a large textile manufacturer, has recently implemented a new dyeing process that utilizes significantly less water and fewer chemical inputs compared to its previous method. However, the auditor discovers that the increased energy consumption of the new machinery, leading to lower water and chemical waste, has resulted in a 15% rise in greenhouse gas emissions from the facility's power source, which is predominantly fossil fuel-based. Considering the holistic approach to social responsibility and sustainable resource management as outlined in ISO 26000, What is the most appropriate conclusion for the auditor regarding the organization's progress in sustainable resource use? Option A. The organization's adoption of new technology is a positive step, but the auditor should recommend further investigation into energy efficiency measures rather than drawing a conclusion on overall sustainable resource use at this stage. Option B. The organization's efforts are insufficient for true sustainable resource use, as the increase in greenhouse gas emissions negates the benefits of reduced water and chemical usage, indicating a need for a more integrated approach to resource management. Option C. The organization has met the basic requirements of sustainable resource use by adopting a new, more efficient process, and the auditor should focus on other areas of social responsibility. Option D. The organization has demonstrated a significant improvement in sustainable resource use by reducing water and chemical consumption, despite the increased energy footprint, as the overall environmental impact reduction is substantial. The correct answer is D. The organization has demonstrated a significant improvement in sustainable resource use by reducing water and chemical consumption, despite the increased energy footprint, as the overall environmental impact reduction is substantial. Explanation. The core of sustainable resource use, as guided by ISO 26000, involves minimizing negative environmental impacts and ensuring long-term availability of resources. This encompasses a life cycle perspective, considering raw material extraction, production, consumption, and disposal. An internal auditor assessing an organization's commitment to sustainable resource use would look for evidence of proactive strategies beyond mere compliance. This includes initiatives like reducing waste generation through process optimization, promoting the use of renewable or recycled materials, and implementing water conservation measures. The auditor would also evaluate the organization's understanding of its resource dependencies and the potential risks associated with resource scarcity or price volatility. Furthermore, the auditor would examine how the organization communicates its resource management performance to stakeholders and integrates these considerations into its overall business strategy. The focus is on demonstrating a genuine effort to decouple economic growth from resource depletion and environmental degradation. For instance, an organization might implement a closed-loop system for a specific material, aiming to recover and reuse it indefinitely, thereby significantly reducing the need for virgin resources and minimizing waste. This aligns with the principle of circular economy and is a strong indicator of advanced social responsibility in resource management. Question 13. An internal auditor is assessing an organization's commitment to human rights within its supply chain, a key aspect of social responsibility as guided by ISO 26000-2010. The auditor plans to interview procurement managers and key suppliers, which interview approach best facilitates the collection of robust, verifiable information regarding the integration of human rights considerations into procurement decisions and supplier selection processes. Option A. Employing a structured interview format with a predefined set of open-ended questions focusing on specific due diligence processes, grievance mechanisms for supply chain workers, and evidence of supplier audits related to human rights standards. Option B. Utilizing an unstructured interview approach, allowing for free-flowing conversation to gauge general awareness of human rights issues among procurement staff and suppliers without specific verification points. Option C. Focusing solely on contractual clauses that mention human rights, assuming these are sufficient indicators of practical implementation and compliance. Option D. Asking primarily closed-ended questions about the existence of policies, without probing into the operationalization or effectiveness of those policies in practice. The correct answer is A. Employing a structured interview format with a predefined set of open-ended questions focusing on specific due diligence processes, grievance mechanisms for supply chain workers, and evidence of supplier audits related to human rights standards. Explanation. ISO 26000-2010 emphasizes the importance of stakeholder engagement in understanding and addressing an organization's social responsibility. When conducting interviews with relevant personnel during an internal audit focused on social responsibility, the auditor's primary objective is to gather information that verifies the implementation and effectiveness of the organization's social responsibility initiatives. This involves assessing how well the organization integrates social responsibility principles into its decision-making processes and operations. The auditor must be prepared to ask open-ended questions that encourage detailed responses, allowing for a comprehensive understanding of practices, challenges, and perceptions. The goal is not to elicit simple yes/no answers, but to explore the nuances of how social responsibility is embedded within different functions and levels of the organization. This includes understanding the rationale behind specific actions, the allocation of resources, and the measurement of performance related to social and environmental impacts. Furthermore, the auditor should seek evidence of how the organization responds to stakeholder concerns and legal obligations, such as environmental protection laws or labor regulations, as these are integral components of social responsibility. The interview process should be structured to cover the core subjects of social responsibility outlined in ISO 26000, such as human rights, labor practices, the environment, fair operating practices, consumer issues, and community involvement and development. The auditor's approach should be objective, seeking to understand the organization's perspective, while critically evaluating the alignment of its practices with its stated social responsibility commitments and relevant external standards or regulations. Question 14. During an internal audit of a multinational corporation's social responsibility framework, an auditor is examining the effectiveness of the company's ethical decision-making processes, a core tenet of ISO 26000-2010. The corporation operates in several countries with varying legal and cultural norms regarding business conduct. The auditor needs to determine which approach best reflects a robust evaluation of the company's commitment to ethical behavior in this complex environment, considering the guidance provided by ISO 26000 on integrity and transparency. Option A. Verifying that the company has adopted a globally recognized ethical certification, irrespective of its alignment with the specific operational context and local regulatory requirements. Option B. Assessing the financial penalties incurred by the company for ethical violations in the past fiscal year, with a lower number of penalties indicating a fully effective ethical framework. Option C. Reviewing the frequency of ethics training sessions conducted for employees, assuming that increased training automatically equates to improved ethical decision-making. Option D. Evaluating the presence and consistent application of a comprehensive code of conduct that addresses potential ethical dilemmas, supported by accessible reporting channels for concerns and evidence of prompt, impartial investigations into reported issues. The correct answer is D. Evaluating the presence and consistent application of a comprehensive code of conduct that addresses potential ethical dilemmas, supported by accessible reporting channels for concerns and evidence of prompt, impartial investigations into reported issues. Explanation. When an internal auditor assesses an organization's adherence to social responsibility principles as outlined in ISO 26000-2010, particularly concerning ethical decision-making frameworks, the focus is on how the organization integrates ethical considerations into its operational and strategic processes. ISO 26000 emphasizes that ethical behavior is fundamental to social responsibility and requires a commitment to integrity and transparency. An auditor would evaluate whether the organization has established clear ethical guidelines, policies, and procedures that address potential conflicts of interest, bribery, and other unethical practices. Furthermore, the auditor would examine the mechanisms in place for employees and stakeholders to report ethical concerns without fear of reprisal, and how such reports are investigated and addressed. The effectiveness of training programs designed to foster an ethical culture is also a key area of review. The auditor looks for evidence that ethical considerations are not merely a compliance exercise, but are embedded in the organization's values and decision-making at all levels, influencing how it interacts with its stakeholders and manages its impacts. This involves assessing the robustness of grievance mechanisms, whistleblower protection, and the accountability structures for ethical breaches. The auditor's role is to determine if the organization's approach aligns with the spirit and intent of ISO 26000, ensuring that ethical conduct is a proactive and integral part of its social responsibility management system. Question 15. An internal auditor is evaluating an organization's adherence to fair operating practices as guided by ISO 26000-2010. The organization operates in a sector with stringent anti-corruption legislation and relies heavily on a global supply chain. During the audit, the auditor discovers that while the company has a code of conduct prohibiting bribery. The procurement department has a history of accepting significant gifts from suppliers, which are then categorized as business development expenses. Furthermore, there is no clear process for investigating or sanctioning employees who violate the gift acceptance policy, and supplier contracts do not explicitly address anti-corruption clauses. Which of the following audit findings would most directly indicate a significant deficiency in the organization's fair operating practices related to anti-corruption and ethical procurement? Option A. Companies' reliance on a global supply chain without a documented supplier code of conduct that specifically addresses labor rights and environmental impact. Option B. The categorization of gifts from suppliers as business development expenses without a clear threshold for what constitutes an acceptable gift. Option C. The existence of a code of conduct that prohibits bribery, even if its implementation and enforcement mechanisms are not fully effective. Option D. The absence of explicit anti-corruption clauses in supplier contracts and the lack of a robust, independently monitored process for investigating and addressing violations of the gift acceptance policy by procurement staff. The correct answer is D. The absence of explicit anti-corruption clauses in supplier contracts and the lack of a robust, independently monitored process for investigating and addressing violations of the gift acceptance policy by procurement staff. Explanation. The core of fair operating practices within ISO 26000-2010 involves establishing and upholding ethical principles and transparent conduct in all business dealings. This encompasses how an organization interacts with stakeholders, manages its supply chain, and adheres to relevant laws and regulations concerning fair competition, anti-corruption, and responsible marketing. An internal auditor assessing fair operating practices would examine the documented policies, procedures, and evidence of their implementation. This includes reviewing contracts for fairness and compliance, verifying anti-bribery training and controls, and assessing how customer complaints related to misleading advertising or unfair pricing are handled. The auditor would look for evidence that the organization actively promotes integrity and prevents practices that could harm consumers, competitors, or the market. For instance, checking if the company has a whistleblower policy that is communicated and effective, and if there are mechanisms to report and investigate suspected unethical behavior in sales or procurement, demonstrates a commitment to fair operating practices. The auditor's role is to ensure that the organization's stated commitment to fairness is demonstrably integrated into its daily operations and decision-making processes, going beyond mere compliance to proactive ethical management. Question 16. An internal auditor is assessing an organization's commitment to sustainable resource use as per ISO 26000 guidance. The organization operates a manufacturing facility that consumes significant amounts of water and energy and generates substantial waste. While the facility meets all local environmental discharge and emission standards, the auditor observes that there is no formal program for water conservation beyond regulatory compliance. Energy efficiency initiatives are ad hoc, and waste management primarily focuses on disposal rather than reduction or reuse. Which of the following approaches best reflects the auditor's evaluation of the organization's sustainable resource use practices in this scenario, considering the intent of ISO 26000? Option A. The organization's ad hoc energy efficiency measures, while not fully integrated, suggest a proactive stance on resource conservation that aligns with ISO 26000 principles. Option B. The organization demonstrates a reactive approach to resource management, focusing on regulatory compliance rather than proactively integrating resource efficiency and circular economy principles into its operational strategy and performance monitoring. Option C. The organization effectively manages its resources by adhering to all legal environmental requirements, indicating a sufficient level of social responsibility. Option D. The organization's resource management is commendable due to its focus on waste disposal, which is a primary concern for environmental protection. The correct answer is B. The organization demonstrates a reactive approach to resource management, focusing on regulatory compliance rather than proactively integrating resource efficiency and circular economy principles into its operational strategy and performance monitoring. Explanation. The core of evaluating sustainable resource use practices within an organization, as guided by ISO 26000, involves assessing how effectively the entity manages its consumption of natural resources and minimizes its environmental impact. This assessment requires an internal auditor to go beyond mere compliance with environmental regulations. It necessitates a deeper dive into the organization's strategic integration of resource efficiency, circular economy principles, and life cycle thinking in its operations. The auditor must examine whether the organization has established clear objectives and targets for reducing resource consumption, such as water, energy, and raw materials, and whether it monitors progress against these targets using relevant performance indicators. Furthermore, the evaluation should consider the organization's efforts to source materials responsibly, promote reuse and recycling, and design products and services with sustainability in mind, thereby minimizing waste and pollution. The auditor's role is to determine the extent to which these practices are embedded in the organization's management systems and contribute to long-term environmental and social well-being, aligning with the broader principles of social responsibility outlined in ISO 26000. This includes understanding the organization's commitment to innovation in resource management and its engagement with stakeholders on these issues. Question 17. An internal auditor is reviewing the climate change mitigation and adaptation practices of a multinational manufacturing firm, as guided by ISO 26000-2010. The firm has set ambitious targets to reduce its Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2030 compared to a 2020 baseline. During the audit, the auditor discovers that while the firm has invested in energy-efficient machinery and is increasing its use of renewable electricity, a significant portion of its Scope 3 emissions, primarily from its extensive global supply chain, remains largely unaddressed. Additionally, the firm's climate adaptation plan focuses narrowly on physical asset protection against extreme weather events at its primary manufacturing sites, with limited consideration for potential disruptions to its raw material sourcing or market access. Which of the following audit findings would most accurately reflect a gap in the firm's adherence to the principles of social responsibility concerning climate change as outlined in ISO 26000-2010? Option A. The organization has not sufficiently integrated supply chain climate impact management and broader climate resilience strategies into its social responsibility framework, leading to an incomplete approach to climate change. Option B. The firm's climate adaptation plan, by concentrating on physical assets, adequately addresses the climate-related risks relevant to its operational continuity and stakeholder expectations. Option C. The organization's emission reduction targets are not ambitious enough to meet international climate goals, indicating a lack of commitment to environmental stewardship. Option D. The auditor's focus on Scope 3 emissions is misplaced, as ISO 26000 primarily directs organizations to manage direct operational impacts, not those of their suppliers. The correct answer is A. The organization has not sufficiently integrated supply chain climate impact management and broader climate resilience strategies into its social responsibility framework, leading to an incomplete approach to climate change. Explanation: when an internal auditor assesses an organization's social responsibility performance, particularly concerning climate change mitigation and adaptation, as guided by ISO 26000-2010, the focus is on the integration of these principles into the organization's core operations and strategic decision-making. ISO 26000 emphasizes that addressing climate change is a critical aspect of environmental responsibility, a core subject of social responsibility. An auditor would examine how an organization identifies its greenhouse gas (GHG) emissions, sets targets for reduction, and implements strategies to achieve these targets. This includes evaluating the effectiveness of energy efficiency programs, the adoption of renewable energy sources, and the management of supply chain emissions. Furthermore, the standard requires consideration of adaptation strategies to cope with the unavoidable impacts of climate change. This might involve assessing how the organization plans for potential disruptions, such as extreme weather events, and how it builds resilience into its infrastructure and operation. The auditor would also look for evidence of stakeholder engagement on climate-related issues, transparency in reporting, and alignment with relevant national and international climate policies or agreements. The goal is to determine if the organization is proactively managing its climate impact and building resilience, rather than merely reacting to regulatory requirements or public pressure. The auditor's role is to provide assurance that the organization's approach is systematic, comprehensive, and contributes to sustainable development, reflecting a genuine commitment to social responsibility beyond compliance. Question 18. An internal auditor is reviewing an organization's approach to social responsibility, specifically its stakeholder engagement processes as guided by ISO 26000. The organization has a broad spectrum of stakeholders, including local community groups, employees, government regulators, and supply chain partners. During the audit, the auditor observes that while the organization regularly publishes sustainability reports and holds annual public forums, the feedback received from these activities appears to have minimal impact on the company's operational decisions or strategic planning concerning environmental impact and labor practices. Which of the following best reflects the auditor's assessment of the organization's dialogue and consultation processes in relation to ISO 26000 principles? Option A. The auditor should focus solely on the regulatory compliance aspects of stakeholder engagement, as ISO 26000 is a guidance standard and does not mandate specific outcomes from dialogue. Option B. The organization demonstrates a superficial level of engagement, lacking the substantive two-way communication and integration of stakeholder feedback into decision-making that is crucial for effective social responsibility. Option C. The organization's commitment to transparency through public forums and reports adequately fulfills the dialogue and consultation requirements of ISO 26000, irrespective of the direct impact on decisions. Option D. The organization's current approach is sufficient, as the breadth of stakeholders engaged in public forums indicates a comprehensive consultation process, even if specific feedback isn't immediately actioned. The correct answer is B. The organization demonstrates a superficial level of engagement, lacking the substantive two-way communication and integration of stakeholder feedback into decision-making that is crucial for effective social responsibility. Explanation. ISO 26000 emphasizes that effective dialogue and consultation are fundamental to achieving social responsibility. These processes are not merely about information dissemination, but are reciprocal engagements designed to understand and respond to stakeholder concerns and expectations. An internal auditor assessing an organization's social responsibility framework would look for evidence that these dialogues are inclusive, representative of diverse stakeholder groups, and that the outcomes genuinely inform decision-making and policy development. The goal is to ensure that the organization's social performance is not just compliant, but also responsive to the societal context in which it operates. This involves identifying key stakeholders, understanding their interests, and establishing mechanisms for ongoing communication and feedback. The quality of these interactions is paramount, meaning the auditor would scrutinize the depth of engagement, the transparency of the process, and the demonstrable impact of stakeholder input on the organization's actions and strategy. This process helps to identify potential risks and opportunities related to social responsibility that might otherwise be overlooked, leading to more robust and sustainable social performance. Question 19. Consider an organization that has received feedback from local environmental advocacy groups regarding potential water contamination from its manufacturing process, an issue not explicitly covered by current environmental regulations. Which of the following internal auditor observations would most strongly indicate that the organization is effectively building trust and credibility with these stakeholders, in alignment with the principles of ISO 26000? Option A. The organization initiated a dialogue with the advocacy groups to understand their specific concerns, but deferred any action pending the outcome of potential future regulatory changes in the sector. Option B. The organization conducted an independent third-party environmental impact assessment, publicly shared the detailed findings and methodology, and subsequently implemented a revised wastewater treatment protocol based on the assessment's recommendations, communicating these changes and their expected benefits to the advocacy groups. Option C. The organization acknowledged the concerns in a formal letter to the advocacy groups, stating that it would review the matter internally at the next scheduled board meeting. Option D. The organization issued a press release stating its commitment to environmental protection and assured stakeholders that its current processes comply with all applicable laws and regulations. Correct answer is B. The organization conducted an independent third-party environmental impact assessment, publicly shared the detailed findings and methodology, and subsequently implemented a revised wastewater treatment protocol based on the assessment's recommendations, communicating these changes and their expected benefits to the advocacy groups. Explanation: the core of building trust and credibility with stakeholders, as guided by ISO 26000, lies in consistent, transparent, and responsive engagement. An internal auditor assessing an organization's social responsibility practices would look for evidence of how the organization actively listens to and addresses stakeholder concerns. This involves not just acknowledging feedback, but demonstrating a commitment to integrating it into decision-making processes and communicating the outcomes. For instance, if a community group raises concerns about a new facility's environmental impact, a credible response would involve conducting an independent assessment, sharing the findings transparently, and outlining concrete mitigation strategies that are then implemented. This proactive and communicative approach, rather than simply adhering to legal minimums or making vague promises, solidifies the organization's reputation for integrity and responsibility. It moves beyond a superficial compliance mindset to one that genuinely values and acts upon stakeholder input, fostering a relationship built on mutual respect and understanding. The internal auditor's role is to verify that these processes are robust and consistently applied across all stakeholder interactions, ensuring that the organization's social responsibility commitments are translated into tangible actions and demonstrable outcomes that build confidence. Question 20. During an internal audit of a manufacturing firm's commitment to social responsibility, an auditor observes that all environmental impact assessments, including the specific methodologies employed for data collection and analysis, are readily available on the company's public website. Which of ISO 26000 guiding principles of social responsibility is most directly demonstrated by this specific action? Option A, ethical behavior. Option B, accountability. Option C, respect for stakeholder interests. Option D, transparency. The correct answer is D, transparency. Explanation: the core of social responsibility as guided by ISO 26000 rests on 7 guiding principles. These principles are accountability, transparency, ethical behavior, respect for stakeholder interests, respect for the rule of law, respect for international norms of behavior, and respect for human rights. An internal auditor examining an organization's social responsibility performance must assess how these principles are integrated into the organization's governance, operations, and decision-making processes. The principle of accountability, for instance, requires an organization to take responsibility for its impacts on society and the environment. Transparency involves making decisions and activities understandable and open to scrutiny. Ethical behavior demands honesty and fairness in all dealings. Respect for stakeholder interests means recognizing and responding to the concerns of those affected by the organization's actions. Adherence to the rule of law is a fundamental requirement, as is respecting international norms of behavior where they offer greater protection than domestic laws. Finally, respecting human rights is paramount, ensuring that an organization does not infringe upon the fundamental rights of individuals. An auditor would look for evidence of policies, procedures, and actual practices that demonstrate commitment to and implementation of these principles across all relevant organizational activities. The question probes the auditor's understanding of which principle is most directly addressed by a specific action, ensuring that all environmental impact reports are publicly accessible and include details on the methodology used for assessment. This action directly aligns with the principle of transparency, which mandates openness in decision-making and activities, allowing stakeholders to understand the organization's performance and impacts. Question 21. When auditing an organization's commitment to sustainable consumption principles, as outlined in ISO 26000-2010, which of the following internal audit findings would represent the most comprehensive evidence of proactive engagement with the entire product lifecycle and its associated impacts? Option A. The organization has published an annual sustainability report detailing its energy consumption and waste generation figures for the past 3 years, which show a steady decrease in both metrics. Option B. The organization has conducted a review of its procurement policies to ensure compliance with national environmental protection laws and has phased out the use of certain hazardous chemicals. Option C. The organization has implemented a comprehensive life cycle assessment for its primary product line, identifying key environmental and social hotspots, and has established specific targets for reducing these impacts across sourcing, production, use, and end-of-life phases, with documented supplier engagement programs aimed at improving upstream social and environmental performance. Option D. The organization has updated its product labeling to include information on energy efficiency ratings and basic recycling instructions for consumers. Correct answer is C. The organization has implemented a comprehensive life cycle assessment for its primary product line, identifying key environmental and social hotspots, and has established specific targets for reducing these impacts across sourcing, production, use, and end-of-life phases, with documented supplier engagement programs aimed at improving upstream social and environmental performance. Explanation: the core of sustainable consumption, as guided by ISO 26000, involves minimizing negative environmental and social impacts throughout a product's life cycle, from sourcing to disposal, while ensuring economic viability. An internal auditor assessing an organization's commitment to this principle would look for evidence of proactive measures that go beyond mere compliance with environmental regulations. This includes evaluating the organization's efforts to influence upstream suppliers to adopt more responsible practices, such as fair labor standards and reduced resource depletion, and downstream consumers to make more informed and less impactful choices. The auditor would examine policies and procedures related to product design, material selection, energy efficiency, waste reduction, and end-of-life management. Furthermore, the auditor would assess how the organization communicates its sustainability efforts to stakeholders and how it integrates feedback to improve its performance. The question probes the auditor's understanding of the multifaceted nature of sustainable consumption, requiring them to identify the most comprehensive indicator of an organization's commitment. A robust approach would involve a systematic review of the entire value chain, from raw material extraction to product disposal, encompassing both environmental and social considerations. This includes verifying that the organization actively engages with its supply chain to promote responsible practices, supports product longevity and recyclability, and educates consumers about responsible use and disposal. Question 22. An internal auditor is evaluating the effectiveness of an organization's governance framework in relation to its social responsibility commitments, specifically focusing on stakeholder engagement as guided by ISO 26000-2010. The organization has established a stakeholder register and conducts annual surveys, but the auditor observes that the board of directors rarely discusses the survey results or stakeholder feedback during their strategic planning sessions. Which aspect of the governance framework is most critical for the auditor to assess as a deficiency in facilitating meaningful stakeholder engagement? Option A. The structural integration of stakeholder input into the decision-making processes at the highest levels of the organization. Option B. The comprehensiveness of the stakeholder identification methodology employed by the organization. Option C. The frequency and variety of communication channels used to interact with identified stakeholders. Option D. The existence of a formal policy explicitly outlining the organization's commitment to stakeholder dialogue. Correct answer is A. The structural integration of stakeholder input into the decision-making processes at the highest levels of the organization. Explanation: ISO 26000-2010 emphasizes that an organization's governance structure should facilitate stakeholder engagement. This means the governance framework itself needs to be designed to allow for meaningful interaction with those affected by the organization's decisions and activities. When an internal auditor assesses an organization's social responsibility performance, they must examine how the governance system supports or hinders this engagement. This involves looking at the processes for identifying stakeholders, understanding their concerns, and integrating this understanding into decision-making at the highest levels. A governance structure that is rigid, hierarchical, and lacks clear channels for stakeholder input would be considered deficient in supporting social responsibility. Conversely, a system that incorporates mechanisms for dialogue, feedback, and responsiveness, even if informal, demonstrates a commitment to this principle. The auditor would look for evidence that the board of directors and senior management are aware of stakeholder perspectives and that these perspectives influence strategic direction and operational practices. This is not about the specific outcomes of every stakeholder interaction, but rather the embedded capacity within the governance framework to enable such interactions and their subsequent consideration. Therefore, the most crucial aspect for an internal auditor in this context is the structural enablement of stakeholder dialogue within the overarching governance system. Question 23. Consider a manufacturing firm that has set a target to decrease its water consumption per unit of production by 15% within 2 years, aligning with its commitment to responsible resource management as guided by ISO 26000. During an internal audit, the auditor discovers that the baseline data used for calculating the 15% reduction was collected during an unusually dry period, which naturally led to lower water usage. The current reporting period reflects a more typical rainfall pattern. What is the most critical consideration for the internal auditor when evaluating whether the organization is meeting its SR performance objective and target in this scenario? Option A. The cost savings realized by the organization due to reduced water bills, as this is a direct financial benefit of the SR initiative. Option B. Whether the baseline data collection methodology was sufficiently robust and accounted for environmental variability to ensure a fair comparison against the target. Option C. The percentage of employees who are aware of the water reduction target and their participation in water-saving initiatives. Option D. The total amount of water saved in absolute terms, irrespective of the per-unit production metric or baseline data anomalies. Correct answer is B. Whether the baseline data collection methodology was sufficiently robust and accounted for environmental variability to ensure a fair comparison against the target. Explanation. When auditing an organization's social responsibility, SR, performance against its stated objectives and targets, an internal auditor must evaluate the effectiveness of the management system in achieving these commitments. This involves more than just verifying data. It requires an understanding of the underlying SR issues, the chosen indicators, and the methodologies used for measurement. ISO 26000, 2010 provides guidance on integrating social responsibility into an organization's core activities. For an internal auditor, this means assessing whether the organization's objectives and targets are genuinely aligned with its SR commitments and relevant stakeholder expectations. For example, if an organization has a target to reduce its carbon footprint, the auditor would not only check the reported reduction figures, but also the process by which these figures were derived, the scope of emissions included, and whether the target itself is ambitious enough to reflect a genuine commitment to environmental responsibility as outlined in ISO 26000 guidance on environmental issues. Furthermore, the auditor must consider the context in which the objectives were set, including any relevant national or international regulations or voluntary standards that might influence what constitutes good social performance. The auditor's role is to provide assurance that the organization is not merely reporting progress, but is actively and effectively managing its SR performance in a credible manner. This includes verifying the data's accuracy, assessing the appropriateness of the chosen metrics, and confirming that the management system supports the achievement of these SR goals. The ultimate goal is to ensure that the organization's SR objectives and targets are meaningful, measurable, and contribute to the broader principles of social responsibility. Question 24. When an internal auditor is tasked with reviewing an organization's human rights risk assessment process, as guided by ISO 26000, 2010, which of the following actions would most effectively validate the comprehensiveness of the identified risks? Option A. Confirming that the risk assessment report was formally approved by the organization's highest governing body and communicated to all employees through internal newsletters. Option B. Examining the organization's public statements on human rights and comparing them against the identified risks to ensure consistency in public messaging and commitment. Option C. Verifying that the assessment methodology considered potential impacts across the organization's entire value chain, including upstream suppliers and downstream product use, and encompassed a broad spectrum of internationally recognized human rights principles. Option D. Checking if the organization has established a dedicated budget for human rights initiatives and allocated resources for external training programs on human rights for its senior management. The correct answer is C. Verifying that the assessment methodology considered potential impacts across the organization's entire value chain, including upstream suppliers and downstream product use, and encompassed a broad spectrum of internationally recognized human rights principles. Explanation: the core of reviewing human rights risk assessments within the framework of ISO 26000-2010 involves ensuring that the organization has systematically identified potential adverse impacts on human rights stemming from its activities and relationships. This process requires an understanding of the specific context in which the organization operates, including relevant national laws and international human rights instruments. An internal auditor's role is to verify the comprehensiveness and effectiveness of this identification process. This means checking if the assessment considered a broad spectrum of human rights, such as those related to labor, the environment, and community well-being, and whether it explored the full range of an organization's operations, supply chains, and product life cycles. The assessment should not only look at direct impacts, but also indirect and cumulative effects. Furthermore, the auditor must confirm that the organization has established criteria for prioritizing these risks based on their severity, likelihood, and the vulnerability of affected stakeholders. The review should also ascertain that the methodology used is robust and considers input from relevant stakeholders where appropriate. A key aspect is ensuring that the assessment is not a one-time event, but is integrated into the organization's ongoing management processes and subject to periodic review and updates as circumstances change or new information becomes available. The auditor is evaluating the thoroughness and systematic nature of the risk identification and assessment, not necessarily the specific mitigation strategies themselves, although the effectiveness of identification directly informs mitigation. The process of identifying human rights risks is foundational to fulfilling the organization's social responsibility in this area. Question 25. An internal auditor is reviewing the organizational governance framework of a multinational manufacturing firm to assess its alignment with ISO 26000-2010 principles. The firm has publicly committed to ethical labor practices and environmental stewardship. The auditor discovers that, while the company has a formal code of conduct and an environmental policy, the board of directors primarily focuses on financial performance metrics during quarterly meetings, with social responsibility considerations rarely appearing on the agenda or in strategic decision-making discussions. Which of the following would be the most significant finding for the auditor concerning the firm's organizational governance in relation to social responsibility? Option A: the reliance on external consultants to develop the company's sustainability reports, indicating a lack of internal expertise. Option B: the governance structure lacks mechanisms to ensure that social responsibility considerations are integrated into strategic decision-making and oversight processes by the governing body. Option C: the existence of a formal code of conduct that addresses ethical labor practices, but is not consistently enforced across all global subsidiaries. Option D: the absence of specific, quantifiable targets for social responsibility initiatives, such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions by a defined percentage. Correct answer is B. The governance structure lacks mechanisms to ensure that social responsibility considerations are integrated into strategic decision-making and oversight processes by the governing body. Explanation: ISO 26000-2010 provides guidance on social responsibility, and while it doesn't mandate specific legal compliance checks in the same way a standard like ISO 9001 might, an internal auditor's role is to assess the organization's commitment to and implementation of its social responsibility principles. Organizational governance, a core subject within ISO 26000, refers to the system by which an organization is directed and controlled. This includes defining responsibilities and authorities for decision-making, accountability, and oversight. When an auditor evaluates an organization's governance in the context of social responsibility, they are looking at how effectively the organization's governing bodies, e.g., board of directors, senior management, integrate social responsibility considerations into strategic planning, decision-making processes, and overall performance management. This involves examining policies, procedures, and the demonstrable commitment from leadership to uphold ethical behavior, transparency, and stakeholder engagement. The auditor would assess whether the governance structure supports the organization's stated social responsibility objectives, and whether there are mechanisms in place to ensure accountability for social and environmental impacts. This assessment is crucial for ensuring that social responsibility is not merely a superficial declaration, but is embedded within the fundamental operations and oversight of the organization. Question 26. An internal auditor is tasked with evaluating the effectiveness of an organization's anti-corruption framework, which is being reviewed against the guidance provided in ISO 26000-2010. The organization operates in multiple jurisdictions with varying anti-bribery legislation. The auditor has noted that while the company has a written policy, it lacks specific procedures for third-party due diligence and has no documented training program for employees on anti-corruption measures. Considering the principles of social responsibility and the need for robust governance, what is the most critical deficiency an internal auditor would identify in this scenario? Option A. The policy's failure to explicitly mention all international anti-corruption conventions, even though it aligns with core principles of ISO 26000. Option B. The auditor's inability to ascertain the precise financial impact of potential corruption without specific quantitative risk assessments. Option C. The existence of a written policy, which, despite procedural gaps, still signifies a formal commitment to addressing corruption. Option D. The absence of specific procedures for third-party due diligence and documented employee training on anti-corruption measures, which undermines the policy's practical application and awareness. The correct answer is D. The absence of specific procedures for third-party due diligence and documented employee training on anti-corruption measures, which undermines the policy's practical application and awareness. Explanation. When an internal auditor reviews an organization's anti-corruption policies and procedures in accordance with ISO 26000-2010, the focus is on ensuring that the policies and procedures effectively address the organization's commitment to preventing bribery and corruption. This involves examining the scope and clarity of the policy, its alignment with relevant legal frameworks such as the UK Bribery Act or the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA, and the robustness of the implemented procedures. Key elements to assess include due diligence on business partners, clear guidelines on gifts, hospitality and expenses, mechanisms for reporting suspected corruption, and the disciplinary actions for noncompliance. The auditor would also look for evidence of training and communication of the policy to all relevant personnel and third parties. The effectiveness of the policy is judged by its ability to mitigate corruption risks and foster an ethical business culture. Therefore, the most critical aspect of the review is to determine if the policy and its associated procedures are demonstrably designed to prevent and detect corrupt practices, reflecting the organization's genuine commitment to integrity and transparency, as guided by the principles of social responsibility outlined in ISO 26000. This includes evaluating the comprehensiveness of the policy in covering various forms of corruption, the practicality of the procedures for day-to-day operations, and the integration of these measures into the overall risk management framework. Question 27. During an internal audit of a manufacturing firm's social responsibility performance, an auditor is examining the organization's approach to working conditions and social protection. The firm has implemented a policy for overtime work that requires employees to work up to 60 hours per week during peak production seasons, with compensation at 1.5 times the regular hourly rate. Employees also receive a basic health insurance plan and a statutory pension contribution. However, the auditor notes that there is no provision for paid sick leave beyond the legally mandated minimum, nor are there any programs to support employees dealing with mental health challenges or family emergencies. Considering the principles outlined in ISO 26000-2010, regarding fair labor practices and social protection, which of the following represents the most significant area for improvement in the firm's current practices? Option A. Ensuring all employees receive health insurance coverage that exceeds the legally mandated minimum. Option B. Increasing the overtime compensation rate to double the regular hourly rate to better reflect employee contribution. Option C. Reducing the maximum permissible weekly working hours to 40 hours to align with international labor standards. Option D. Enhancing social protection by introducing comprehensive paid sick leave and dedicated mental health and family support programs. The correct answer is D. Enhancing social protection by introducing comprehensive paid sick leave and dedicated mental health and family support programs. Explanation. ISO 26000-2010 provides guidance on social responsibility, including principles and core subjects related to working conditions and social protection. When auditing an organization's commitment to fair labor practices and employee well-being, an internal auditor must consider how the organization addresses issues such as reasonable working hours, fair remuneration, and the provision of adequate social protection benefits. The standard emphasizes that organizations should respect workers' rights and provide safe and healthy working environments. This involves ensuring that employment practices are non-discriminatory, that workers are free from harassment and abuse, and that there are mechanisms for grievance resolution. Furthermore, social protection encompasses measures like health insurance, retirement plans, and support for employees facing personal challenges, aligning with principles of decent work. An auditor would assess the effectiveness of policies, procedures, and actual practices against these expectations, considering relevant national labor laws and international conventions that may inform best practices. The auditor's role is to evaluate the organization's efforts to go beyond mere legal compliance and demonstrate a genuine commitment to its workforce's welfare. Question 28. During an internal audit of a manufacturing facility operating under the jurisdiction of a nation that has ratified ILO Convention 155 concerning occupational safety and health, an auditor is tasked with evaluating the effectiveness of the organization's social protection measures for its workforce. The auditor discovers that while the company provides statutory health insurance and adheres to the minimum legal requirements for working hours, there is a documented increase in minor workplace injuries over the past year, and employee feedback consistently mentions inadequate personal protective equipment, PPE, and insufficient training on hazard identification. Which of the following approaches best reflects an auditor's responsibility in assessing the social responsibility related to working conditions and social protection in this scenario, according to the principles of ISO 26000-2010? Option A. Focus solely on the legal compliance aspects, noting the adherence to minimum working hours and statutory health insurance, and report any identified deficiencies in PPE or training as separate operational issues unrelated to social responsibility. Option B. Recommend the organization enhance its provision of PPE, implement more comprehensive hazard identification training programs, and investigate the root causes of the increased minor injuries to ensure alignment with the spirit of social responsibility beyond minimum legal compliance. Option C. Advise the organization to review its insurance provider contracts to ensure they offer the most extensive coverage possible, as this is the primary indicator of effective social protection. Option D. Conclude that the organization is compliant with its social responsibility obligations, as it meets the statutory requirements for health insurance and working hours, and therefore no further action is needed. Correct answer is B. Recommend the organization enhance its provision of PPE, implement more comprehensive hazard identification training programs, and investigate the root causes of the increased minor injuries to ensure alignment with the spirit of social responsibility beyond minimum legal compliance. Explanation. An internal auditor assessing an organization's social responsibility performance, particularly concerning working conditions and social protection, must evaluate the alignment of the organization's practices with relevant national labor laws and international standards. ISO 26000-2010 emphasizes the importance of fair labor practices, including safe and healthy working environments, reasonable working hours, fair wages, and access to social protection mechanisms. When reviewing a company's approach to worker well-being, an auditor needs to go beyond mere policy statements and examine the actual implementation and effectiveness of these measures. This involves verifying that the organization not only complies with mandatory legal requirements, such as those mandated by the International Labor Organization, ILO, conventions ratified by the host country, but also strives for best practices that foster a positive and supportive work environment. For instance, assessing the availability and accessibility of grievance mechanisms, the provision of adequate training on workplace safety, and the extent of Social Security coverage provided beyond statutory minimums are crucial aspects. The auditor should also consider the organization's responsiveness to employee feedback and its efforts to continuously improve working conditions. A robust assessment would involve reviewing records, conducting interviews with employees and management, and observing workplace practices to ensure that social protection measures are not just documented, but are actively and equitably applied across the workforce. Question 29. An internal auditor is reviewing an organization's adherence to the principles of social responsibility as guided by ISO 26000-2010. The organization has a policy to minimize its environmental footprint, exceeding the minimum requirements set by national environmental protection legislation, which mandates specific waste disposal protocols. During the audit, the auditor discovers that while the organization strictly follows the legally mandated disposal methods, it has not yet formalized its voluntary commitment to further waste reduction into its operational procedures, or communicated these enhanced practices to its stakeholders. Based on the foundational understanding of social responsibility within ISO 26000-2010, which aspect is most critically absent in the organization's current approach concerning its environmental impact? Option A. The complete cessation of all waste generation, regardless of economic feasibility or technological capability. Option B. The strict adherence to all legally mandated environmental protection regulations, irrespective of any voluntary initiatives. Option C. The exclusive focus on internal operational efficiency without considering the broader societal implications of its waste management practices. Option D. The integration of its voluntary commitment to waste reduction into its management systems and transparent communication of these enhanced practices to relevant stakeholders. The correct answer is D. The integration of its voluntary commitment to waste reduction into its management systems and transparent communication of these enhanced practices to relevant stakeholders. Explanation. ISO 26000-2010 defines social responsibility as the responsibility of an organization for the impacts of its decisions and activities on society and the environment through transparent and ethical behavior that contributes to sustainable development, taking into account the expectations of stakeholders. It is also understood to integrate socially responsible behavior into the organization's practices and culture, and into its policies, products, and services, and to the extent that its activities and impacts are not covered by the law. Socially responsible behavior should also consider relevant laws and conform to international norms of behavior. The core principles of social responsibility, as outlined in ISO 26000, are accountability, transparency, ethical behavior, respect for stakeholder interests, respect for the rule of law, respect for international norms of behavior, and respect for human rights. An internal auditor's role is to assess how well an organization is integrating these principles into its operations and decision-making processes, and how it is addressing its impacts. This involves looking beyond mere legal compliance to understand the organization's voluntary commitments and its proactive approach to societal and environmental well-being. For instance, an auditor would examine not just whether an organization complies with environmental regulations, but also how it manages its waste streams beyond legal requirements, or how it engages with local communities on environmental concerns. The emphasis is on the organization's understanding of its broad influence and its commitment to operating in a manner that benefits society and the environment. Question 30. During an internal audit of a multinational corporation's adherence to social responsibility principles, an auditor is reviewing employment contracts and related HR policies. The company operates in several countries, each with its own labor laws. The auditor discovers that while the company's overarching policy states a commitment to fair wages, some legacy employment contracts, particularly for long-term employees hired before recent legislative updates, stipulate wages that are now below the current statutory minimum wage in one of the operating countries. The company's HR department argues that these contracts are grandfathered and therefore still legally binding as per the original agreement. Which of the following best reflects the auditor's assessment of this situation in the context of ISO 26000-2010 guidance on social responsibility? Option A. The auditor should identify a potential nonconformity with the principle of fair remuneration and worker well-being, as the organization's social responsibility commitment requires proactive alignment with current legal standards and ethical treatment of all employees, even if existing contracts are technically valid under older statutes. Option B. The auditor should conclude that the company is compliant because the employment contracts were legally valid at the time of signing, and the company's overarching policy is aspirational rather than prescriptive for existing agreements. Option C. The auditor should recommend a review of all legacy contracts to ensure they meet the minimum wage requirements of the country where the employee is currently working, but consider it a minor issue if the original contract was legally sound at the time of its inception. Option D. The auditor should focus solely on whether the current wage rates exceed the minimum wage set by the national legislation, disregarding the historical context of the contracts and the company's stated social responsibility commitments. The correct answer is A. The auditor should identify a potential nonconformity with the principle of fair remuneration and worker well-being, as the organization's social responsibility commitment requires proactive alignment with current legal standards and ethical treatment of all employees, even if existing contracts are technically valid under older statutes. Explanation: the core of reviewing employment contracts and policies for social responsibility, as guided by ISO 26000, involves ensuring that these documents align with principles of fair labor practices, respect for human rights, and the organization's commitment to its stakeholders. Specifically, an internal auditor examining these aspects must verify that contract terms and company policies do not contravene national labor laws, international labor standards, or the organization's own stated social responsibility objectives. This includes scrutinizing clauses related to working hours, wages, benefits, non-discrimination, freedom of association, and grievance mechanisms. The auditor needs to assess whether the policies actively promote a safe and healthy work environment, prevent forced labor and child labor, and uphold the dignity of all employees. For instance, if a company operates in a jurisdiction with a legally mandated minimum wage that is higher than what is stated in some older employment contracts, the auditor would identify this as a nonconformity. Similarly, if a policy on disciplinary actions lacks a clear, impartial appeals process, it would be considered deficient from a social responsibility perspective. The auditor's role is to provide assurance that the organization's employment practices are not only legally compliant, but also ethically sound and reflective of its commitment to social responsibility, as outlined in the guidance. This involves looking for evidence of consistent application of policies and fair treatment of all employees, regardless of their role or background.